The barking woke her first, then the wind. Then, underneath both, a sound Claire Bennett had learned to fear more than either, the low groan of wood giving way. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, yanking her coat over her nightgown, shoving her feet into boots that were still crusted with yesterday's mud. Outside, the snow was coming sideways, and somewhere past the barn, Bandit was barking like the world was ending. "Sam, stay inside," she called up the stairs. "I mean it." Her son's face appeared at the top, hair sticking up, eyes wide with the particular alertness of a 12-year-old who has learned, too early, what it sounds like when something is wrong. "Is it the horses? Stay inside." She grabbed the flashlight from the mudroom, and after a half-second of hesitation she would later be ashamed of, the old shotgun that had belonged to Daniel. She told herself it was for coyotes. Some nights, out here alone with a kid and 11 acres and a fence line that never seemed to stay fixed, she wasn't sure what she was really afraid of anymore. The snow hit her like something with intention. She put her head down and pushed toward the north pasture, flashlight beams swinging wild across drifts already knee-deep, and that was when she saw him. A shape, crouched low at her fence line, half swallowed by the storm, a dark figure with something metal glinting in his hands. Every instinct she had went cold and sharp at once. "Hey!" Her voice cracked across the wind. "Hey, get away from there." The shape didn't run. That was the strange part. It straightened, slow, like a man who'd been caught doing nothing worse than checking the mail, and lifted both hands where she could see them. "Claire, it's just me." She knew the voice before the flashlight beam found his face, but she kept the light on him anyway, kept her thumb near the safety, because 2 years of doing everything alone had taught her that just me was not an answer, it was a dodge. "Walt," her breath came out in a cloud ragged. "What are you doing on my property at midnight in a blizzard?" Walt Hutchins, 60 feet of fence between his land and hers, a man she'd exchanged maybe 40 sentences with since the funeral, stood there with a roll of wire looped over one shoulder and a fence tool in his gloved hand, snow already collecting on the brim of his hat, and said nothing for a long moment. "Fence was down," he finally said. "Figured I'd fix it before your horses found the gap." "You figured?" She stared at him. Behind her, Bandit had stopped barking, which somehow made it worse, as if even the dog understood something she didn't. "You just happened to be out here, in this." Something like that. That's not an answer. He looked at her for a second too long, the way a man looks at something he's decided not to say, and then bent back down to the fence, like the conversation was finished. Posts rotted through on this end. "I can brace it tonight, do it right in the spring." Claire stood there with a shotgun. She suddenly felt foolish holding, snow melting down the back of her collar, and something in her chest twisted between fury and confusion, because this wasn't the first time. 6 weeks ago, after the first hard freeze, she'd walked her fence line expecting to find the usual damage, and found the west corner already mended, wire pulled taut and clean, in a style that wasn't hers. 3 weeks before that, a section near the creek that she knew had been sagging for a month had simply stopped sagging. She'd told herself it was luck, coincidence, maybe old wire settling right on its own. She did not actually believe that, and standing in the snow now, watching Walt Hutchins work a fence post, with the calm of a man doing something he'd done 100 times before, she understood she'd been lying to herself for 2 winters. "Walt." She lowered the flashlight so it wasn't in his eyes. "Have you been fixing my fences all this time?" He didn't look up. Fence needed fixing. That's still not an answer. The wind dropped, just for a moment, the way it sometimes does in the eye of a storm, and in that small silence Walt Hutchins looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Something that lived somewhere between guilt and grief, and said the only thing he seemed willing to say. "Some promises you don't get to explain, Claire. You just have to keep them." Then he shouldered his tools, tipped his hat, and walked back into the storm toward his own land, leaving her standing at her fence line, with more questions than she'd had before she'd ever picked up the flashlight. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. Not because of the cold, and not because of the wind rattling the shutters, but because of 6 words that kept circling her mind like something caught in a current. Some promises you don't get to explain. A promise to who, about what, and why would a man who'd barely spoken to her in 2 years be out in a blizzard, on her land, fixing what wasn't his to fix? By morning the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world scrubbed white and silent. Claire made coffee she didn't drink and watched steam curl off the mug while Sam ate cereal across from her, watching her with the same 2 observant eyes his father used to have. "You look like you didn't sleep," Sam said. "I'm fine. Was it the horses?" "No, everyone's fine." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Eat your breakfast." He didn't push, which was its own kind of ache, because Sam had learned not to push the way children learn not to touch a stove twice. Since Daniel died, her son had gotten quieter, steadier, older than 12 should be. And some mornings Claire wasn't sure if that was resilience or just a different kind of wound. She thought about Walt again. Ranch families didn't usually keep to themselves the way he did. They borrowed tools, traded eggs, showed up for branding season. But since his wife Ellen had passed, 6 or 7 years back now, Walt Hutchins had become a man who kept his fences tight and his door mostly closed. Claire had always assumed it was grief that made him that way. Now she wasn't so sure grief was the whole story. That afternoon she found herself walking the fence line again. This time in daylight, this time looking, really looking, at every repair she'd assumed was hers, or luck, or nothing at all. The wire near the creek was newer than the rest, spliced with a particular double-loop knot she recognized from watching Daniel work 100 times. Not her knot, not the way she tied it. It was Daniel's knot. She stood there a long moment with her glove pressed against the cold metal, feeling something crack open in her chest that she'd kept sealed shut for 2 years. And for the first time she let herself wonder, not why is Walt doing this, but a harder question underneath it. Did Daniel ask him to? She didn't confront Walt again that week. Some part of her wasn't ready for the answer. Instead, life did what it always did on the ranch. It kept moving whether she was ready or not. A pipe froze and burst in the barn. Sam came down with a cough that kept them both up 2 nights running. The truck wouldn't start on the coldest morning of the month, and Claire stood in the driveway at 6 a.m., with her breath fogging the air, fighting back tears she refused to let fall in front of her son. That was the morning Walt's truck pulled up the drive. He didn't knock. He never did. He simply parked, popped his hood, walked over to hers, and started working like he'd been invited. "You don't have to do this," said, arms crossed against the cold. "I know. Then why? Battery's dead. Won't take but a minute." He didn't look up from the engine. "Sam get to school all right?" "He's got a cough. I kept him home." Walt nodded slowly, like this mattered to him more than it should. "Ellen used to make a honey and thyme tea for that. I could bring some by if you want." The offer sat strange in the cold air. Small, plain, and somehow more intimate than anything he'd said to her in 2 years. Claire studied him, this quiet, weathered man with hands that clearly knew engines and fences and grief in equal measure, and found herself asking the question she'd been circling for a week. "Walt, did Daniel ask you to look after us?" His hands stilled on the battery cables. For a moment the only sound was wind moving through the bare cottonwoods along the drive. "Why would you think that?" "Because you fix things that aren't broken enough for me to notice. And you disappear before I can thank you. And last week you told me some promises you don't get to explain." She kept her voice steady, though her heart wasn't. "That's not a coincidence, Walt. That's a man keeping his word to somebody." He closed the hood slower than the job required, buying himself time the way men do when the truth costs them something. "Try it now," was all he said. She turned the key. The engine caught. "Thank you," she said, and meant it 2 different ways. Walt wiped his hands on a rag, looked at her for a long beat, and for once didn't retreat immediately into his truck. "Your husband was a good friend to me, Claire. Better than I deserved, some years. His jaw worked like there was more behind it. That's all I can say right now. Why can't you say more? Because it's not just my story to tell. He climbed into his truck, then paused with the door half shut. I'll bring that tea by tonight. For the boy, he did. He left it on the porch without knocking, the way he left everything, quietly, without asking for thanks, without staying long enough to be thanked. Claire stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear down the frozen road, and understood, with a certainty that unsettled her, that whatever secret Walt Hutchins was keeping, it had her late husband's fingerprints all over it. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way it always did in the valley. A warm afternoon here, a hard freeze there, mud replacing snow only to freeze again overnight. Through it, Walt kept showing up in small, unannounced ways. He never made it a habit anyone could point to. He wasn't there every day, or even every week, but when the pipes froze, he had a torch and know-how before she'd finished dialing the plumber. When Sam's science project needed a working motor, and Claire had no idea where to find one, a small box of spare parts appeared on the porch with no note. When the vet bill for her mare Daisy came due the same week as the property tax, Walt showed up with a truck full of split firewood, since you'll want the extra for spring nights, and never once mentioned money, though Claire suspected. Later, when she did the math on what firewood that size would have cost, that the wood had been a kindness dressed up as a chore, she started noticing him the way you notice weather changing. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small differences. The way he crouched to Sam's eye level instead of talking down at him. The way he asked about her horses by name. The way, once, she caught him watching her laugh at something Sam said, and he looked away fast, like he'd been caught somewhere he wasn't supposed to be standing. You like him, said one evening, apropos of nothing, while they shelled peas at the kitchen table. I don't know what you mean. You smile different when his truck comes to drive. Sam said it the plain way children say true things, without cruelty, without agenda. Dad would probably like him too. He's the kind of guy Dad always liked. Quiet, fixes stuff. Claire's hands stilled over the pea pods. What makes you say that? Sam shrugged, 12 years old and wiser than he should have to be. I don't know. He just feels safe. Like Dad did. That night, after Sam went to bed, Claire sat on the porch in the cold with a blanket around her shoulders and let herself feel, for the first time in 2 years, something that wasn't grief and wasn't guilt, but sat close enough to both that she almost didn't recognize it as hope. She still didn't know Walt's secret, but she was starting to suspect that whatever it wasn't something to be afraid of. She was wrong about that. Not about the fear, but about how much it would cost her to learn the truth. The barn fire started with a faulty heat lamp over the tack room and nearly ended with far more than scorched wood. Claire smelled smoke before she saw it, and by the time she'd pulled her boots on and sprinted across the yard, orange light was already licking up through the hayloft window, and Daisy was screaming, the high, terrible sound a horse makes when fire is close and there's nowhere to run. Sam, call for help, she shouted, already hauling the barn door wide, smoke rolling out to meet her. She got 2 horses out before the smoke turned the barn into something she couldn't see through. Eyes streaming, throat burning, Daisy still trapped in the far stall, rearing against a latch that had swollen and stuck in last week's rain. She didn't hear Walt's truck. She heard his voice instead, suddenly right behind her, steady in a way that cut through her panic, like a rope thrown to someone drowning. Claire, get back, I've got her. The latch is stuck, got her. Go. She didn't go. She stood at the barn door, coughing into her sleeve, watching a man run into a burning building for a horse that wasn't his, and understood in that moment, clear and sudden as the flames themselves, that whatever secret Walt Hutchins carried, it did not change the plain fact in front of her. This was a man who ran toward danger for people who weren't his responsibility, again and again, without being asked. He came out with Daisy seconds before the loft beam gave way, both of them coughing, singed but whole, and Claire's knees nearly buckled with relief. The volunteer fire crew arrived 20 minutes later to find the fire mostly out, the horses safe in the round pen, and Walt sitting on the tailgate of his truck with an oxygen mask the paramedics insisted on, refusing to go to the hospital, refusing every kindness offered to him, the way he refused every kindness offered to him. Claire sat beside him on that tailgate long after the trucks had gone, Sam wrapped in a blanket nearby, and finally asked the question that had been building in her for months. Why do you keep showing up for us, Walt? Really? Tell me the truth. He looked at his hands, blackened with soot, and then at her, and something in his face finally gave way. Not like a wall falling, but like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for 2 years. Because I promised your husband I would. The fire trucks were long gone. Sam had fallen asleep on the porch swing, exhausted past fear, and Claire sat beside Walt in the cold night air, waiting. Daniel and I got close the last year, Walt began, his voice low, unhurried, like a man finally allowed to put a story down after holding its weight alone. You remember he used to help me with Ellen's care near the end. Drove her to appointments when I couldn't leave the ranch. Sat with her some afternoons so I could sleep. He paused. I never told you that, because he never wanted credit for it. That was Daniel. Quiet about the things that mattered most. Claire's eyes stung, and not from smoke. I didn't know that. No reason you would. He didn't do it to be thanked. Walt turned the oxygen mask over in his hands, not looking at her. After Ellen passed, your husband was the only person who came around regular. Just sat with me. Didn't try to fix the grief. Just sat in it with me. We got to talking, some nights, about what scared us most. What scared him. Walt was quiet a moment, leaving you and the boy without enough. Not money, he wasn't afraid of that. He was afraid of you being alone in a way nobody could see. Afraid you'd carry this ranch and this boy by yourself and never let anybody close enough to help. Because that's who you are, Claire. You don't ask, you just carry it. She wanted to argue. She couldn't because it was true. 6 months before the accident, Walt continued, he asked me for something. Made me promise. If anything ever happened to him, I'd watch over you. Not obvious. He knew you'd never take charity. Just quiet. Fences. Firewood. A hand when you didn't know you needed one. He said, she won't let anyone help her on purpose, Walt. You'll have to be sneaky about it. A ghost of a smile crossed Walt's face, gone as fast as it came. I told him he was being morbid. Man was 38 years old. I told him nothing was going to happen to him. But something did. Something did. Walt's jaw tightened, and I made a choice at his funeral that I've kept every winter since. I never meant for you to find out this way. I never meant for you to find out at all, honestly. I figured, a promise like that, you keep it best by never being caught keeping it. Claire sat with that for a long moment, feeling something enormous shift inside her. Grief and gratitude, and something that felt dangerously close to anger, all tangled together. So all this time, she said slowly, every time you showed up, the fences, the truck, the firewood, that wasn't you. That was you keeping a promise to a dead man. Claire, that's what you're telling me. Her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. That none of it was really you. It was an obligation, a debt you owed him. That's not. Walt stopped himself, started again, slower. That's not what I'm telling you. But the damage was already moving through her, fast and cold, and Claire stood up from the tailgate before he could find the rest of the words. Because 2 years of being strong alone had taught her exactly one thing with total certainty. She did not want to be anybody's promise. She wanted for once to be somebody's choice. I need to go check on, she said, and walked away before he could see her cry. For 3 weeks, Claire didn't speak to Walt Hutchins beyond what politeness required at the mailbox. She told herself it was reasonable. She told herself a woman was allowed to feel betrayed when she learned that 2 years of small kindnesses had a hidden ledger behind them, a debt paid quietly to a dead man instead of freely given to her. But underneath the anger was something rawer, something she didn't say out loud even to herself. The fear that she had let herself hope for something that had never actually been about her at all. Sam noticed the silence, the way he noticed everything now. "You haven't talked to Walt in a while," he said one night, doing homework at the kitchen table while she mended a torn barn coat. "We've both been busy. You're mad at him." Claire set the needle down. "It's complicated, bud. He didn't do anything wrong, though." Sam said it simply, the way children cut through things adults tangle up. "Dad asked him to help us. That's not a bad thing. That's just Dad being Dad. He was always worried about stuff like that." "I know. So why are you mad?" Claire looked at her son, steady, clear-eyed, 12 years old, and somehow understanding something she hadn't let herself understand yet, and found she didn't have a ready answer. That night, after Sam went to bed, she sat with Daniel's old toolbox open on the kitchen table, the one she never let herself go through, and found, tucked beneath a layer of wrenches, a folded piece of paper in her husband's handwriting. A list. Things Claire won't ask for help with. Fence repairs, truck maintenance, firewood in bulk. Anything that costs money she'll insist we don't need to spend. Underneath, in different ink, added later, "Talk to Walt. He'll keep an eye out. Don't tell her. She'll refuse it out of pride. And I love her too much to let pride be the reason she struggles alone if I'm not here." Claire sat at her kitchen table and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in 2 years. Not for Daniel's death, which she'd grieved 100 times over, but for the depth of a love that had planned, quietly, for a future he wouldn't get to see, because he could not stand the thought of her carrying it alone. And somewhere in that grief, a harder truth surfaced, one she'd been avoiding since the barn fire. Her anger at Walt had never really been about Walt. It was about Daniel, about losing him, about how unfair it felt that even his kindness, reaching forward from beyond his death, was still a reminder of everything she'd lost. Walt hadn't done anything wrong. He'd kept a promise to his best friend for 2 winters running, expecting nothing, asking nothing, hiding in the cold rather than take credit for a single act of it. That wasn't obligation. That was love, wearing the only disguise it was allowed to wear. She found him at the fence line, of course. Where else would Walt Hutchins be? On a cold spring morning, mending something that had likely held fine through the winter, but that he was checking anyway, the way he always did. He straightened when he saw her coming, wary now in a way that hurt her to see, like a man bracing for a second round of the same wound. "Claire, I found Daniel's list," she said, no preamble, because she'd practiced this walk across the field enough times to know she'd lose her nerve with small talk. "The one where he asked you to look after us. I found it in his toolbox last night." Walt's hand stilled on the wire. "Claire, I'm sorry. I should have told you differently. Or, sooner. Or, I'm not here for an apology." She stopped a few feet from him, close enough to see the tired lines around his eyes, the same ones she'd been too angry to notice 3 weeks ago. "I'm here because I've spent 3 weeks being furious that everything you did for us started as a promise to a dead man. And then I read his handwriting last night, and I understood something I should have understood the first night I caught you in the snow." "What's that?" "A promise like that isn't a chore, Walt. Nobody keeps a promise that carefully, that quietly for 2 winters if it's just a debt they're paying off." Her voice shook, but she kept going. "You could have fixed my fence once and called it done. You didn't have to fix the truck. You didn't have to run into a burning barn for a horse that isn't yours. You didn't have to bring Sam spare parts for a science project, or tea for a cough, or firewood you never once asked me to pay for." She swallowed. "That's not obligation. That's not a debt. That's just who you are, Walt. Daniel didn't hand you a promise you were forced to keep. He handed a promise to the one man he knew would keep it because he wanted to, not because he had to." Walt was quiet a long moment, the wind moving gently through the grass between them. Nothing like the storm of that first night. "I loved him like a brother," Walt said finally roughly. "And somewhere in these 2 years, watching you raise that boy alone, watching you carry this whole ranch on your back and never once complain, I started." He stopped, shook his head like he was arguing with himself. It doesn't matter. I told myself it wasn't my place. You were his wife, grieving. The last thing you needed was some old widower confusing a promise with something else. Something else like what? Claire asked, though she already knew, though her heart was already answering for him. Walt looked at her then, fully, for the first time letting her see everything he'd kept behind that quiet, careful distance. Like falling in love with you, he said. Somewhere between the fences and the firewood. I didn't mean to. I fought it for a year, told myself it was disrespectful to Daniel's memory, told myself you'd never see me as anything but the man who used to be your husband's friend. But it happened anyway, Claire. And I've been terrified of you finding out, because I was afraid you'd think exactly what you thought 3 weeks ago. That none of it was real, that it was just a promise. The wind moved through the pasture. Somewhere behind her, faint, she could hear Sam's laughter as he threw a ball for Bandit in the yard, the ordinary sound of a life still being lived. It was a promise, Claire said quietly, and it became something more. Both things can be true, Walt. Can they? They already are. She stepped closer, close enough now that she had to tip her head back slightly to hold his eyes. I've spent 2 years being so afraid of needing anyone that I almost miss the one person who never once made me feel weak for needing help. You didn't just keep a promise to my husband. You kept faith with everything he loved. This ranch, my son, and, somewhere along the way, me. Her voice broke on the last word, and she let it. I'm not angry anymore, Walt. I'm asking you not to disappear into the cold anymore. Not after every kindness. I'd like to actually get to thank you, for once. Walt reached out, slow, like he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a hand still rough from 2 years of quiet, unclaimed work. I think, he said, I could manage that. Spring came in earnest after that. The way it does in the valley, mud drying to green, the cottonwoods budding out, Daisy and the other horses shedding their heavy winter coats in the pasture. Walt didn't disappear into the cold anymore. He came for dinner on Thursdays, at first, then more often than that, and Sam took him with the easy, unguarded trust of a boy who had been quietly hoping for exactly this, without knowing how to ask for it. They spent a whole Saturday rebuilding the toy truck Daniel had started with Sam, years before, and never finished. And Claire stood in the doorway of the workshop watching them, and did not try to stop the tears that came, because for the first time in 2 years they weren't only tears of grief. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't loud. Walt Hutchins did not know how to be loud about anything, least of all love, but he showed up, every day in the same quiet way he always had. Except now he stayed for coffee afterward. Now he told her, plainly, when he was proud of how she'd handled a hard week. Now when she cried about Daniel, which still happened, some nights without warning, he didn't try to fix it or explain it away. He just sat with her in it, the way he'd once sat with Daniel in his own grief. Because that, she was learning, was the truest thing about him. He never tried to replace what was gone. He simply made room, patiently, for what could still grow. One evening in early June, with the pasture gold in the last of the light and Sam off at a friend's house for the night, Walt found her on the porch steps, the way he had that first winter, except this time there was no flashlight, no fence to fix, no storm to hide behind. I've been thinking, he said, sitting beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. About promises. Careful. Last time you mentioned a promise, it took me 3 weeks to come around. He almost smiled. This one's different. This one I'm not keeping in secret. He turned to face her, and for a man who had spent years being careful with his words, he said the next one's plainly, without hedging. I'd like to make you a promise you actually get to hear, Claire. Not one whispered to your husband in a hospital room. One I say straight to you. He took her hand, weathered fingers wrapping gently around hers. I promise to keep showing up, not because anyone asked me to, because I choose to. Every winter, every fence, every hard week, I want it to be because it's you, not because it's owed to somebody else. I love you, plainly, out loud. However long you'll let me say it." Claire looked at this quiet, steady man who had spent 2 winters loving her family in secret because he was too afraid and too honorable to claim more than he thought he deserved, and understood that the fences he'd mended were never really about wire and wood at all. They were about holding together everything that mattered, patiently, without asking for credit, until the day she was finally ready to see it. "I love you too," she said. And for the first time in 2 years, saying it out loud didn't feel like losing something. It felt like coming home to it. They married the following spring, a small ceremony on the porch, where it had all quietly begun, with Sam standing between them, holding a horseshoe Daniel had once nailed above the barn door for luck. Some winters still bring storms. The fences still need mending, the way fences always do. But now Claire walks the fence line beside Walt instead of after him, and some mornings Sam comes too, learning the same double loop knot his father once tied, passed down now through a man who kept a promise so faithfully it became, in the end, something far bigger than a promise ever could have been on its. Love, Claire had learned, rarely announces itself. Sometimes it simply shows up quietly, in a snowstorm, checking the fences of a life it isn't ready to admit it's already chosen, until one day it finally is the end.